Betty White, a life that affected generations, and the real reason for her death. Betty White was not just a comedian or an actress. She was a cultural icon, a lady whose kindness, wit, and fortitude spanned over a century of transformation in American entertainment. The world was shocked to learn of her passing in late 2021. Betty White, who was only a few weeks away from turning 100, passed away at the age of 99, signaling the end of an era that few people in Hollywood history ever get to represent. Grief, affection, and introspection erupted in response to her passing, alongside newer generations who had found her through contemporary sitcoms, viral interviews, and her timeless wit. Fans who had grown up watching her on black and white television grieved. In the midst of the tributes, however, several people posed a straightforward and compassionate query. What actually led to Betty White's demise? It is crucial to comprehend the remarkable life that came before it in order to comprehend that last chapter. Early life. A survivor's formative years. On January 17, 1922, Betty Marion White was born in Oak Park, Illinois. She grew up as an only kid amid a period of extreme national unpredictability. Her early years were affected by the Great Depression, which taught her fortitude, thankfulness, and thrift, qualities that she carried with her throughout her life. After her family relocated to Los Angeles, little Betty fell in love with stories and animals. Her childhood dream was to work with wildlife, not to become famous. At first, acting was just a method to make ends meet and maintain artistic fulfillment. She had no idea that she would go on to become one of the most influential people in entertainment history. Getting started with television before it was ready, long before television had become a household staple. In the late 1930s, Betty White entered the entertainment industry. At a time when women were rarely granted career control, she worked in radio, did live ads, and took on modest acting jobs. She left acting to join the American Women's Voluntary Services during World War II, where she drove military supply trucks and contributed to the war effort. When she came back, television was still in its infancy, and Betty White had laid the groundwork for it. She went on to co-create and appear in Life with Elizabeth, making history as one of the first female television producers. During a period when women were supposed to stay in supporting roles, Betty quietly but forcefully broke down boundaries and gained respect by acting professionally rather than protesting. A career that wouldn't slow down. Most actors have a peak and a decline, neither did Betty White. From the 1940s to the 2020s, she worked consistently in every decade of her life, making appearances in comedies, game shows, advertisements, and movies. Contrary to Hollywood's fixation with youth, her most well-known roles came later in life. Her portrayal of Rose Nyland on The Golden Girls won her admiration on a global scale. Many of Betty's personal characteristics were reflected in the character's kindness, innocence, and unexpected knowledge. Rose reflected Betty White's comedy philosophy by being kind without being weak and humorous without being cruel. Through Hot in Cleveland, appearances on talk shows, and her iconic hosting of Saturday Night Live at the age of 88, she was once again accepted by later generations. She seemed to have limitless vitality. Her sense of humor seemed timeless. Strong, but not untouchable, health in her later years, Betty White was not exempt from the effects of aging, despite her vibrant personality and keen intellect. She frequently talked openly about paying attention to her body, taking breaks when necessary, and sticking to routines that kept her mind active. She lived peacefully in Los Angeles throughout her latter years, surrounded by close friends and caregivers. Although she had slowed down in public, she continued to watch TV, study screenplays, and stay informed. Crucially, Betty White had no known long-term fatal illness. This is a crucial aspect that sets her death apart from many others. There was no protracted hospital stay, no protracted fight with cancer, and no public decline. Her death was unexpected, which is one of the reasons it was so shocking. The reason for death. Comprehending the medical truth. At the age of 99, Betty White died quietly at home on December 31, 2021. A cerebrovascular accident, also referred to as a stroke, was listed as the official cause of death on her death certificate. A stroke happens when there is a blockage or hemorrhage that stops blood flow to the brain. Strokes can occur unexpectedly in older people, sometimes without any evident warning signals, and even with timely medical attention, they can be fatal. According to accounts, Betty White had a stroke a few days prior to her passing. There was no indication of neglect, no external harm, and no trauma. In keeping with old age, it was a normal medical occurrence. There were no reports of her experiencing protracted suffering, and her death was regarded as serene. Why a 99-year-old stroke is important for medicine. The body naturally changes at age 99, making it more vulnerable. The brain becomes more vulnerable to disturbances in oxygen supply, circulation slows, and blood vessels become less elastic. These internal mechanisms are brittle, even in people who seem alert and intelligent. Even while having a stroke at such an old age is not unusual, it nevertheless has a significant impact. Because there is frequently little time to prepare or step in, the suddenness can be emotionally taxing for loved ones. The instance of Betty White serves as a reminder of a subtle reality. Longevity does not provide immunity from death. Rather, it merely enhances the significance of the last chapter. Public reaction, a pause in the world. The news of Betty White's passing on New Year's Eve seemed unreal. Within minutes, condolences from fans, politicians, celebrities, and animal rights groups flooded social media. Many said they couldn't believe it. Others thanked her for living such a long and fulfilling life. Some lamented the symbolic loss, the sense that a steady, reassuring presence had abruptly vanished. Millions of people felt a personal connection to her passing since she had been a part of their life for many years. She was trusted, not just observed. Her 100th birthday's irony. The timing was perhaps the most devastating detail. In just 17 days, Betty White would turn 100, a milestone that was already being commemorated. To celebrate her century of life, memorials, magazine covers, and documentaries were created. Those festivities became memorials after her death. However, many admirers took solace in the fact that she lived for almost a century, dying on her own terms and without experiencing protracted pain. Her last wishes and family. Betty White was a reclusive individual. Although she never had biological children, she remained close to her stepchildren from her marriage to Alan Ludden, as well as a select group of friends and co-workers. She didn't want lavish rituals or public funerals. Her desires placed a strong emphasis on privacy, dignity, and action-based memory, especially for animal welfare organizations that she had long supported. In compliance with those desires, her remains were treated in secret. A legacy greater than death. Betty White's life is not diminished by concentrating on her cause of death. Rather, it completes the narrative. She worked hard, loved profoundly, laughed a lot, and lived a long life. Like her life, her death was quiet, natural, and dignified. Betty White stood out for her humility in a field known for extravagance and conceit. She demonstrated that significance has no expiration date in a society fixated on youth. Concluding thoughts. The death of Betty White was not a tragedy in the conventional sense. It was the end of a chapter that had been masterfully written from start to finish. Even the brightest lights must eventually dim, as evidenced by her cause of death, a stroke at the age of 99. However, the warmth they leave behind endures. It wasn't only that Betty White lived a long life, she had a happy life, and that might be the most significant legacy of all. When Betty White passed away, it seemed more like the silent farewell of someone who had always been there than the loss of a famous person. She was more than just an actress and comic for many years. She was a reassuring presence and a well-known grin that cut across generations. The world stopped as word spread that Betty White had passed away only a few weeks before turning 100. It didn't seem authentic. It still doesn't. Complications from a stroke, a sudden and devastating medical catastrophe that took her calmly and without extended suffering, were eventually identified as the cause of her death. It felt appropriate in a way since it wasn't dramatic, drawn out, or encircled by spectacle. Betty White departed from this earth with the same dignity and grace that characterized her life. There was no agonizing farewell tour or protracted public decline. She was here, still witty and cherished, and suddenly she was gone. Many fans were shocked not only by her passing, but also by what she stood for. Betty White had come to represent pleasure, resiliency, and longevity. Instead of making aging seem scary, she made it seem fun. She accepted change, laughed at herself, and never allowed her age to determine how relevant she was. Her death from a stroke so served as a sobering reminder that even the most resilient people are fallible. Strokes are not self-announced. They cut through existence in an instant by showing up abruptly and frequently without notice. For Betty White, it was a subdued conclusion to an incredibly loud legacy. No matter how alive the soul is, the body eventually reaches its limit. which is why a life full of joy, compassion, and purpose came to an end. Not because she had slowed down. Because of how deeply ingrained she was in daily life, her loss is particularly poignant. People grew up with Betty White, not simply watched her. Year after year, she made appearances in living rooms, transitioning from black and white television to contemporary humor without ever losing her charm. She gave them a sense of inclusion, comfort, and visibility. Her smile seemed sincere. It felt pleasant when she joked. She did it without fear as she grew older, and she encouraged the rest of us to follow suit. Many were compelled by her passing to consider both the reason and the transience of time. Her life may have terminated due to a stroke, but it was not diminished. The decades of fun, the limits she broke, and the lives she touched were not erased by it. If anything, it demonstrated how comprehensive her journey had been. Instead of leaving behind unresolved issues, she left behind appreciation. Tributes came in from all across the world in the days that followed her passing. Actors, comedians, animal lovers, and regular fans all related how Betty White cheered them up in difficult times. Being remembered for comfort rather than scandal or controversy is an uncommon legacy, for generosity, for happiness. Not only did Betty White enjoy a long life, she had a purposeful life. Her ultimate breath may have been taken by a stroke, but her impact would never be diminished. In replays, she keeps laughing. The people she inspired are a reflection of her goodness. Her influence can be seen in the way we discuss growing older, with a little more laughter and less worry. Betty White is no longer with us, but she will always be with us, because tales become a part of us and never disappear.